Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Revisiting Madmen. I'm very happy you've joined me. We're going to be analysing the Hobo Code in today's episode, and we'll get into it straight away. I just want to quickly say thank you to Kerem, who designed the new Madmen logo. He's one of my closest friends, and I love the logo, so thank you for your work. And with that said, we can go into the episode. If this is your first episode of Revisiting Madmen, I'm sure for most of you it's not, but if this is your first episode, please don't listen on unless you finish the entire show. Especially in this episode, I ruin a lot. There are a lot of spoilers. Thank you guys. Enjoy the episode. Season 1, Episode 8 of Mad Men. This episode is called The Hobo Code, and it was written by Chris Provenzano and directed by Phil Abraham. The opening scene of this episode shows Pete walking into the elevator, and Hollis is in there, and Peggy also enters as well, and they make some small talk here discussing why they're both in the office so early. And then the next scene shows Peggy coming into Pete's office, and Pete actually makes a move on Peggy, and they have sex on the couch in Pete's office. And then Pete confesses to Peggy that he feels like his wife is just another stranger. And this sets the tone of the rest of the episode. Pete is the embodiment of a depressed person in this episode. He is super sad, really. And he feels lonely. He doesn't feel like he connects with his wife. And that's one of the reasons I think that he's sleeping with Peggy in the first place. Next, we see Don entering the office, and he's shown with that shot that I've mentioned before in Mad Men of the camera above his shoulder following his back as he walks into his office, and he greets Peggy and he notices that her blouse is ripped, which actually occurred when she was having sex with Pete, and he asks her what happened there, and she says that she caught it on something. I might start keeping a spare. This line is certainly a reference to that shot we see of Don's desk drawer in season 1 episode 1, where he opens the drawer and there's several clean white shirts ready for him to change into when he comes from a night out to the office, basically. And by giving this line to Peggy, they could be telling us a few things. One of the things they could be saying is that the city is corrupting Peggy. We know that Sally in season 5 episode 7, which is called At the Codfish Ball, Sally calls the city dirty. And it's one of the things that Mad Men brings up a lot. I think Trudy Campbell is heard saying it at one point as well, saying that New York is this dirty, corrupted place, and it corrupts those who are in it. Secondly, they could be saying that it's advertising that's corrupting Peggy. This is another point that Mad Men make, most obviously in the whole storyline with Joan prostituting herself for a promotion and for the betterment of Sterling Cooper. And Peggy here saying that she might start keeping a spare could also be saying that. Could also be saying that advertising is this dirty place and Peggy's now a part of that world and she's also going to be corrupted and sleeping around with people who she shouldn't be sleeping around with. Thirdly, this line could be foreshadowing Peggy's eventual rise. There are these wonderful videos on YouTube made by a channel called The Take. And on their video where they analyse Peggy, they call her Don 2.0. And there are several examples of Mad Men clearly showing Peggy turning into Don. One of them, for example, when she's in the theatre and she has her arm resting on the chair next to her, which is exactly how Don sits. And also the fact that she's in the theatre in the first place to blow off steam is something she learnt from Don, because that's obviously what Don does as well. And that time when Don is eavesdropping on her pitch, and this is after she's left Sterling Cooper, and she uses one of his quotes verbatim, which is the line where Don says, "If you don't like what's being said, then change the conversation." So there's plenty of examples of Peggy turning into Don, and this is one of the earliest and most subtle examples of how Peggy is slowly turning into this man. Next, I want to talk about the Belle-Jolie meeting. And I'm going to discuss Don's representation in this meeting later on in the podcast. But for now, I want to talk about the copy, which is Peggy's copy. And it's very successful, partly because of the way Don sells it, of course, but also because Peggy wrote some good copy. Immediately after this scene, we see the men celebrating the win of the Belle-Jolie copy. And Peggy comes in with ice, and Don surprises her, I think, when he says, "Help yourself to a drink. You know, you won. This is your copy that won us this pitch." And she does help herself to a drink here. Once again, this episode is showing us Peggy slowly but surely entering the advertising world, and I guess they're showing us the nascent stages of her, what will be a very successful career in advertising. And then Peggy is seen telling other colleagues, female colleagues now, about the success of her copy, and she's telling Joan as well. And her joy here is really an indication of her ambitiousness, I think. One of the reasons she gets so far in her work is because she really gets a thrill out of it. She gets a lot of joy out of winning pitches and writing copy and writing successful copy. Because that's another point Mad Men makes when it comes to Peggy's character. She's absolutely a workaholic. We see this when she has I forget her boyfriend's name. What is his name? Okay, I don't remember his name, but when she does, it's Abe. Abe is his name. When she is going out with Abe, we see a lot of shots of them, or a lot of scenes where her work is sort of getting in the way of her relationship with Abe. And there's even the scene where Abe is sitting in her office eating a sandwich while she works, because she's a workaholic. And I think this is, again, coming back to showing us the nascent stages of her career. It's showing a little bit, I think, as to why she's such a workaholic. She gets a lot of joy out of her work. She's very ambitious. She enjoys success. And her celebrations continue. We see several Sterling Cooper colleagues at a bar celebrating with Peggy about her copy. And Pete is there also. And you won't see a better portrayal of depression than Pete sitting alone in the corner of this bar with a drink in his hand. All of his colleagues are there dancing, smiling, laughing, enjoying the brilliant song, The Twist. And yet he's miserable. He is absolutely miserable. And Peggy notices this from afar. She does the twist all the way to Pete and asks him to dance with her, to which he says, "I don't like you like this," which is a harsh thing to say. And Peggy goes back to the dance floor, and I think she even sheds a tear here, because it does affect her that Pete rejected her like that. And at the end of this episode, or just before it ends, we're shown Peggy at her desk, and Pete walks into the office, and she's looking at him, probably waiting for him to say hi or at least give her a look, but he doesn't. And I read somewhere that it was originally planned for Pete to look at Peggy, and they were probably going to share those very Mad Men looks where, not much is said, but they just have a solemn look at each other. But they cut it out, and I think it was Vincent, the actor who plays Pete, whose idea it was to do that. And I think it works. I think it's very powerful to have, because it's a very relatable feeling, isn't it? When you might be interested in someone who you work with, or if you're in school or college or whatever, and it feels like they don't even notice you. It's a really sad feeling for Peggy, I think. But that's all I have to say for Peggy. Let's move on to Don Draper now. And his storyline in this episode is so heartbreaking, so brilliantly written. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. So the first time we see Don, as I've already mentioned, is when he's coming into the office, and the camera is above his shoulder. And the next scene with Don is set in Bert's office, Bert Cooper's office, where Bert, out of the blue, gives Don a bonus, and it's quite a hefty bonus. I believe they say it's $2,500, which I checked on an inflation calculator, is equivalent to about $21,600 in today's money. So it is quite a lot of money. It's quite a huge bonus, and I think there's a reason it's quite a big bonus, and I'll get to that later on as well. But I think the bottom line is that they're telling us that all of this money that Don has, it doesn't really mean anything for his mental state, for what he feels like on the inside, which isn't pleasant. I haven't really got much else to say about that scene with Bert. There is quite a lot of interesting stuff going on, but there's not too much to analyse. There's a lot of Bert doing what he does quite often, which is being kind of a father figure to these people, Don to Roger, being somewhat of a mentor. He recommends the book Atlas Shrugged to Don. I haven't read it yet, and I'm guessing it's because he identifies that Don is similar to himself, in that he's completely self-interested, is the term that Bert Cooper uses. And he also says that Don is unsentimental about all the people who depend on his hard work. And I haven't read Atlas Shrugged, but I'm guessing this novel that Bert recommends would teach Don the opposite, a little bit about how to be less self-interested and more selfless and less nasty, a bit more soft maybe. This is all speculation. I literally haven't even read the novel yet, but it seems that that's what Bert's getting at. I doubt he's saying, Don, you're self-interested. Here's a novel which will teach you to be more like this. I don't know, maybe it is. But it seems to me that Bert, being as old as he is and as seemingly wise as he is, would be trying to teach Don how to deal with some of his more negative aspects of his character. And then something very strange happened. Don takes this bonus and goes to Midge's apartment, where she's having a gathering with loads of her mates, and they're smoking and listening to music. And Don immediately says to Midge, let's go to Paris. He's got the bonus. He shows her the bonus and he says, let's go. I wasn't even sure if he was being sincere. Later on, we find out he was totally being sincere. But what we never find out is, does he mean he wants to go on a holiday? Does he mean he wants to run again? Does he want to change his name? You know, all these questions are left unanswered. Who knows what Don's intentions were here? All I know is it's fucking weird. Why do you want to run? I mean, I know why he wants to run. He hates his life. He's miserable, but Jesus, it's not the solution, man. But Don has a moment here where he goes into the bathroom in Midge's apartment and he looks into the mirror and we get our first flashback of this episode. Anytime we're shown Dick's childhood, it's really heartbreaking. This scene of Dick's childhood home opens with a homeless man approaching the family and he asks for some work. And Archibald Whitman, who's Dick Whitman's dad, is kind of a dick to this homeless man, but Abigail invites him to stay for dinner, and the homeless man looks at Dick and I think he says hi to Dick, and Dick is extremely shy, extremely timid as a child, and when the homeless man says he reminds me of myself, Abigail turns to him and says, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. And I think this kind of emotional abuse is probably still underestimated by some people, as in they underestimate the impact to one's self-esteem, self-image. Abigail is supposedly this young boy's mother. She's supposed to be raising him to be a well-adjusted human being, and yet she speaks of him in such a disgusting, derogatory way, comparing him to, this homeless man. And Dick isn't just emotionally abused. We know that she also physically beats him, and when he becomes a teenager and starts living in the brothel, he's even sexually abused by a May. So he gets the whole gamut of abuse in his childhood, which goes some way to explaining why he's so fucked up and why he's so damaged as an adult. But more on that later. Dick Whitman has a lot more dialogue. Young Dick Whitman, that is, has a lot more dialogue with the homeless man later, and I'll get onto that because there's some interesting stuff to talk about. For now, let's talk about the next scene, which is dinner at Dick Whitman's house. Abigail, who's already been talking about religion a lot, continues talking about religion in a scene where they're eating dinner with the homeless man, and Archibald Whitman is also at the table. And Abigail says that her mum, she brings up this quote that her mum used to tell her as a child, which is, she says, my mum always said that life is like a horseshoe. Fat in the middle, open on both ends, and hard all the way through. As I said, Abigail's already been talking a lot about religion, but this worldview that Abigail's mother taught her is a very Christian worldview. This idea of suffer now and you'll reap the rewards later, i.e. in the hereafter, in heaven. And it's a very traditional Christian view. I don't think all Christians think that. I don't think Christianity even represents that. I think there's some interpretation of Christianity where it's talking about heaven being in the here and now, when we think about Jesus Christ's quote saying, the kingdom of heaven is now. But I digress. Let's go back to, why does she say this? I think one of the reasons is because she says the word horseshoe, and it's foreshadowing Archibald Whitman's eventual death. He eventually gets kicked in the face by a horse, which unfortunately Dick Whitman witnesses. And as funny as that cause of death is in fiction, it's obviously utterly tragic to actually imagine and to witness for Dick. To see his dad die like that is horrible. And the other thing that's happening in the scene is Abigail says that quote and she puts a coin on the table, and Archibald Whitman takes the coin and says, you can get that tomorrow after you've done some work, or something to the effect of that. I am paraphrasing. And throughout this dinner scene, Dick Whitman is silently watching whilst eating his dinner. Later on in the episode, the flashback continues. This time, Dick Whitman comes to give the homeless man his bedding, and he says that I'm supposed to tell you to say your prayers. And the hobo actually has a very meaningful conversation with young Dick Whitman here, and I think it's a conversation that sticks with him as well. Before we delve into the conversation in detail, I do want to mention that Dick Whitman says a line here where he says, she ain't my mama. And this is almost verbatim to what he says to Adam Whitman in the episode 5G, when Adam calls Abigail mum and he says, she isn't my mum. He never saw that woman as his mum. She never treated him like a son. I don't really blame him. But it is interesting that they have Don Draper, Dick Whitman, repeating that line. He's an orphan, really. I know he technically did grow up with his dad until the age of about 10, but his dad wasn't much of a father. His stepmom Abigail was an absolute horrible woman. Having said that, I forgot to mention this in the dinner scene. I think one of the points of that dinner scene is also to show the complexity of Abigail and the complexity of all human beings, which is what Mad Men teaches us. Yes, Abigail treats Dick Whitman like an absolute bastard, but at the same time, she's also seen giving money to this homeless man and offering her home to this man who they don't know, and yet she's happy to open her house to this man and give him a meal and a bed. And how many of us would do that? You know, it's a very kind gesture. Yet, of course, she's also horrible. So we have to remember both sides of that. But back to the scene of Dick Whitman and this hobo. There's a lot of dialogue I want to talk about. One of the first things I want to talk about is Dick Whitman's line where he says, "Ain't you heard? I'm a whore child." And this is when he's talking about Abigail not being his mum. And I think this is an extremely significant line, because this reveals how Don Draper feels on the inside. This reveals his self-image. He sees himself as nothing but a whore child. He wasn't loved as a child. And I think the problem with that on a psychological level is Don grows up not believing that he's unloved, but believing that he's unlovable. And there's a difference. When I read the Diary of Anne Frank, there's a lot of Anne Frank talking about her self-worth, and she speaks of herself as a very intelligent young woman and a very pretty young woman and someone who's going to achieve great success in her life when she's older. And this is despite her sometimes feeling unloved by her parents, by her mum especially. However, what Anne Frank's mum didn't make her feel is unlovable. And that's what Don feels because of his upbringing. He feels like he has a lot of shame about his past, and he doesn't feel like he's someone worthy of love, despite how we see him on, in his pitch, for example, when he sells Peggy's copy. He's this godlike, effortless human being who's effortlessly cool and very attractive and capable and intelligent, but he doesn't see himself this way. He still sees himself the way he did as a child, as nothing but a whore child. And I can't remember if I read this in an essay by Freud, or if I read it in a book by Lindsay C. Gibson. But I think it is the book by Lindsay C. Gibson, where she makes the point that your psychological makeup is often set in stone from the age of about 5 or 8 years old, which is around the age that Dick Whitman is here. And I think Mad Men, by giving him this line, are saying that, yeah, this is, don't get the wrong idea. This is how Don feels today. It's not how he felt as a child, it's how he feels right now. And that's why he's so destructive in his behaviors, and that's why he maybe doesn't feel like he deserves Betty or the life that he has. And going back to the check that Bert Cooper gave him, the bonus, I think things like that, the money, don't do anything for Don's mental state. I think he's always that same kid, that unloved, unlovable kid. Of course, we know there's a lot of value to him and there's a lot of value to everyone, but he doesn't feel that way. He feels horrible. And the hobo tells, I don't like calling him the hobo, the homeless man tells them the story, actually just on his name, since I mentioned it there. And I know this episode is a little bit all over the place. Apologies for my scattered thoughts. On the name of the hobo, he is never given a name. And I think this is, if you've read Of Mice and Men and if you studied it, you may remember, I remember my teacher describing why Curly's wife in that story is never called by her name. She's only ever referred to as Curly's wife. And it's simply to reflect that person is of a lower status in that world. The homeless man isn't given a name because he's nothing but a hobo. He's nothing but a disgusting homeless man in the eyes of, at least Abigail, and in the eyes of Archibald Whitman. And that's why they don't name him. That's why the writers don't name him. Anyway, back to his conversation with Dick. He starts telling his story a little bit and describing that he once had it all. He had the money. And this is the money that we see Don Draper getting. That's why they include the scene of Bert giving him a huge bonus. We know that Don is rich. And the homeless man too was rich, he says. He says that he also had a beautiful wife. And he had a beautiful house. And yet he was miserable. So one day he just vanished. He got up and he left that life behind. And I think Don, the young Dick Whitman, learns from this conversation that he too can do this. The hobo says that we all wish we were from someplace else. And Dick Whitman sees that this man was like him. He hated his life and he ran away. And I think Dick internalizes that, and that's why he eventually thinks that that's an appropriate thing to do when the opportunity presents itself. In the Korean War, when he sees that he can run away from his life, he takes that opportunity. And I think it's because he learnt this from the hobo. And the hobo also says that since becoming homeless and since becoming a deserter, basically, he some days sleeps under the stars, some days sleeps, with a roof over his head, but regardless of where he sleeps like a stone. He sleeps in peace, and he's at peace with himself. And I think Don, again, when he eventually does steal another man's identity, I think when he's running, he's seeking what that homeless man has, which is that peace and that feeling of being able to sleep like a stone, basically, and being comfortable and safe and comfortable within your own skin. However, obviously, we know that Don doesn't have that comfort, that peace. He's very, very much a tormented man. And I think that's for a few reasons. There's a fundamental flaw in the way Don escapes, which is that the stealing of that man's identity. It means that he has to be a deserter and a dishonest man for the rest of his life, unless he chooses, which he doesn't do, unless he chooses to just be upfront with everyone about what he did. Because I don't think, it's obviously just speculation, but who's to say he would be an outcast if he was to admit to his true past. The thing with shame is that the more secrets you keep and the less you talk about your demons, the more they fester in your mind. And I don't remember who says this, but someone says, and this is something that I've heard this point being made in Freud's essay, The Unconscious, but it's also a quote from a comedian where he says, if you don't face your demons, they go in the recesses of your mind and they do push-ups. I think this was actually a quote from Dax Shepard, and he's making the same point that Freud is making, which is you have to face those repressed emotions and those demons, otherwise they do just grow and grow, and you turn into a man like Don who's, just miserable. He's got the house, he's got the wife, the kids, he's got all the money in the world, and the looks and the confidence and the intelligence, but he's not happy because he's dishonest, he's full of shame, he hasn't faced his demons, and really it's a recipe for disaster, what Don's done to his life. You're not going to be happy if you follow those footsteps. And I think part of the reason the homeless man, if indeed he's telling the truth and he does sleep like a stone, I think it's because he hasn't got the same issues that Don will have in his future. He's not lying about who he is. This homeless man still has his own identity and his own name. But Don doesn't. Don is constantly lying to everyone. Every time he introduces himself, he's lying because he's not really Don. He's Dick Whitman. He's a poor farmer's boy, essentially. And this conversation with the homeless man takes place right next to where the horses are staying. In fact, we see some of the horses behind Dick Whitman. And I bring this up because the hobo says, if death was coming any place, it's coming here, kid. It's creeping around every corner. And they're actually standing. Where Dick Whitman is standing is almost in the exact location where he witnesses his dad eventually get kicked and killed by a horse. So the homeless man was right. Death is coming to that place and very soon. And if you want to watch that scene or that episode where Dick witnesses his dad's death, it's in season 3, episode 13, I believe. And it got me thinking, why is there so much foreshadowing of Archie's death in this episode? There's the mention of the horseshoe. There's this mention from the homeless man about death coming here and it's around the corner. I think it's to get us to start thinking about Dick Whitman's relationship with his father. This conversation with the homeless man is actually quite intimate. There are actually quite a lot of lessons taught here. For example, the Hobo Code, which I'll get into in a sec. And I think it's to make the point that Dick Whitman never had these conversations with his dad, his own dad. And that's why when this hobo teaches him about how to run away from your life, he takes that lesson on board because he doesn't know right from wrong. He doesn't have his own father telling him how to become a good man, an honest man. He knows what this homeless man tells him and he follows in this homeless man's footsteps because he hasn't got any guidance from his own parents. Now onto the Hobo Code. The hobo teaches Don these symbols, and the one that we're most concerned about is the one that the symbol of the dishonest man. After teaching Dick the Hobo Code, he gifts him a piece of chalk as well, and he says that you're an honorary to Don, to Dick Whitman. And one of the last things he says to Don is, don't be scared, kid. Again, I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier. Don doesn't hear that from his own dad, ever probably. He probably never has his dad tell him, don't be scared. Because I don't think his dad is having those sorts of meaningful conversations with his son. And after this conversation with the homeless man, we see Dick Whitman the next morning sitting on the front steps of the house, and the homeless man approaches Archibald Whitman and thanks him for his hospitality, and he waits for his money for the work that he did. And Archibald Whitman here lights a cigarette and says, you be on your way now. And the homeless man does. He hasn't really got a leg to stand on here, so he just walks off without payment. He's probably just grateful to have had a night to sleep in their house, to be honest, and a warm meal. But anyway, we see Dick chase after the man, and Dick Whitman goes to the front of his house and sees that his house has been labelled now. It's been marked with a symbol that means a dishonest man lives here. And he looks at the symbol on the front of the house, and then he looks at his dad and he sees, he probably imagines at that point, my interpretation is he imagines, Jesus, I don't want to be like that when I'm older. I don't want to be a dishonest man. I don't want my house to have a mark on the front of it saying that I'm a liar. I don't want people to look at me that way. But going back to Midge's apartment now, we see Don, he doesn't seem to be in a very good place here mentally. He's kind of desperate, and he asks Midge, let's go to Paris, let's go now. And he's a little bit angry as well here. And she says, I can't. And of course you can't. You can't just up and leave like that. Not unless you're Dick Whitman. And when she says she can't, he writes her a check. And this is, again, repeating the patterns of his father. We've just seen this flashback of Don's dad being a dishonest man. And we know that Don doesn't want to be like that. That's the whole point of these flashbacks. He doesn't look favorably upon his dad. He doesn't want to be like that. And yet he's repeating the same mistakes. He's paying women for sex. It's not just Midge he pays for sex. I believe we see Don at one point paying Sylvia for sex and paying his secretary for sex. In some form or another, he ends up repeating his dad's mistakes when it comes to prostitution and alcoholism as well. We know that Dick's dad is an alcoholic, and so is Don Whitman. So is Don Draper as well, of course. He absolutely an alcoholic, and he's repeating those same mistakes as his dad. Anyway, he gives her the check. He puts it in her bra, in her chest area, which again is probably symbolic of the sort of driving home the prostitution idea and the themes of that there. And the next scene we see Don arriving home, and this scene really makes me tear up because it's very, very touching. Don comes home and goes immediately to Bobby's bedroom, and he wakes up Bobby and he says to his son, ask me anything. And Bobby says, why do lightning bugs light up? And Don looks at his son and he doesn't have the answer, and he just says, I don't know, but I will never lie to you. This line tells me that Don does want to be a good man, and he does want to be a better father than his dad was. However, obviously we know he's fallen into many of the same habits, and the main thing that we see Dick Whitman realize in the flashbacks is that his dad is a liar, his dad is dishonest, and we know that Dick deep down doesn't want to be that. Yet, in the final scene of this episode, we see Don arriving back at the office, presumably the night after he slept in Bobby's bed after their short conversation. And surprise, surprise, what shot are we shown of Don here when he's walking into the office? It's the exact shot that we're shown in the beginning. There's a certain mirroring here of the camera once again following Don from above his shoulder. We're watching his back, and he walks into the office. He says hi to Peggy, just like in the beginning of the episode. And then he walks into his office and he shuts the door onto the camera, which ends showing the words Donald Draper, his name on the front of the office, on the front of his office. And it made me consider why have they given this episode this cyclical nature, and why have they repeated the same shot twice? And I concluded that it's those words Donald Draper on his office are the exact same thing to Don, in Don's mind at least, as the symbol that the hobo put on Dick Whitman's childhood home of Archibald Whitman being a dishonest man. Donald Draper, those words on his door symbolize the same thing to Don Draper here, because his name obviously is Dick, it's not Donald Draper. So seeing that every morning is just a reminder to Don that you are a dishonest man, you are your father. And we know that Don says this later on to Sally in season 7, where Sally's having a go at her dad for, I guess, being too flirtatious with her friend, and he says, listen Sally, you are exactly like me and your mum. Because Don knows that there's a certain inevitability about it. He knows from his own life, as much as he tried not to become like his father, he repeated the same mistakes, and that's what happens, We learn certain things from our parents, the good and the bad, and we try to, of course, behave in a better manner and in a more healthy manner, but we can't help it. Some of the things that we do, some of our characteristics, I know I've got some negative aspects of my parents' personality, and Don obviously has, and I bet everyone really has. It's just how it goes, isn't it? And then I was reminded again of the check that Bert gave Don, and the pitch in which Don is so eloquent and so effortless in his selling of the product, and everything that he does, he appears so superhero-like. But I think him seeing another man's name on his door every morning, people calling him by another man's name every day, I think the point is that that's enough to eat away at a man. It doesn't matter that he's rich. It doesn't matter that he's got, this seemingly picture perfect life. He's not happy. He's disturbed. It's that simple. I think he feels like his father. I think he feels dishonest. And that is all I have to say for this week's episode. I know I've already apologized, but I want to apologize again because I feel like this episode is a little bit scattered. I'm a bit poorly, maybe that's why, but I didn't want to use that as an excuse to not record an episode at all. I hope you enjoyed the analysis of the Hobo Code. It's one of my favorite episodes. Thank you very much for listening.